Astrid Bowlby of Honey Petal Plants. Good to see you, Astrid.
Nice to see you, Mary Davis.
Thanks so much for your contribution to the Pollinator Garden, and I'm hoping today we can learn what it's all about. It seems to be all the rage, and I don't really understand why or how it's different from what I used to do in the 80s with my English cottage-style flower garden.
Well, I would say it probably isn't that much different in certain ways. You know, you're upping the flower power, and that brings in the insects, which then feed the birds, the baby birds. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of those things. So we would say that there are maybe 5 major reasons to plant 4 pollinators in our landscape, and we can call it a pollinator garden like we have here. And specifically it's around a vegetable garden. So the first idea about it might be that you are planting more things that are attractive to insects, and when those insects come in to feed on those things, they're also pollinating your vegetable plants.
But I don't have a vegetable garden, so is it required that I have a vegetable garden to have a pollinator?
Absolutely not. That's just one of the reasons to help pollinators. There are a lot of other reasons. For example, you might want to grow a pollinator garden to, maybe you don't want to use chemicals in your garden. So if you grow a pollinator garden that has a lot of different kinds of flowering plants in it, both perennials and annuals, you are attracting, you've made a buffet for your insects, and the insects come in, and some of those insects actually feed on some of our bad insects. So when you get that balance going in your garden, you can often forego things like chemical pesticides. And one of the reasons to do that, there are 2 main reasons. One of them is that they are not pest specific, which means they're harming all of the insects in your garden, which means that there's less food for baby birds, less food for the mommy and daddy birds. The other thing is that pesticides run off into our water systems, and that affects what our drinking water, and it affects us in the long run as well. So it doesn't only affect the part of the ecosystem, it affects all of the ecosystem. So whether or not you're growing veggies, growing plants for pollinators is a really good idea.
So you talked about ecosystem. How does native plants, how does that play into a pollinator garden?
So native plants are very important, and I suggest to people that they grow at least 70% natives in their garden. And the main reason to do that is most of our insect pollinators are actually native pollinators. Yes, we have honeybees, and those have been introduced, and we love our honeybees, but our native insect populations are under so much pressure and threat right now. And if we plant the plants that they have evolved with over a long period of time, those are the plants that they are used to feeding off of, and those are the plants that their babies are used to feeding off of. And for certain pollinators, there are very specific host plants that we need to plant. For example, most people are familiar with the relationship of monarch butterflies, their larvae, to milkweeds. So their larvae only feed on milkweeds. So it's very important that we provide that baby food in our gardens. Plus, there are so many beautiful milkweeds that we can have in our gardens. Some are native to Maine and some are not. But providing that baby food is really, really important. And most larvae have specific relationships with specific plants. And if they're native insects, their relationships are with our native plants.
So if I wanted to focus on monarch butterflies, what would be the flower like once they're flying around? Is there a specific flower, or is it again the milkweed? It's the milkweeds for the larvae and the butterfly.
So the butterflies certainly do feed off the pollen and nectar on milkweeds, but they are generalist feeders. So you can provide what we would call good landing pads and good flowers for different kinds of insects, have different kinds of mouth parts, and they feed differently. So like a hummingbird has a really long beak and a long tongue, and they like those bell-shaped flowers, and they can get right down in there. Other pollinators, in particular butterflies, like a nice landing pad. So yarrows, coneflowers, milkweeds, Joe Pye weed.
Is that Zydia there? Would that be considered a landing pad?
Yes. So this is a really great landing pad, and actually this part around here, the color, acts sort of like a signpost, and the butterfly or other pollinator comes in and lands, and actually these little guys are the flowers that they feed off in the center of that plant. And when they do that, they're getting nectar and pollen for their own purposes, but as they move from one plant to another, they're also pollinating that crop. So that helps seed set. And when seed sets on plants, there are two things that happen. We can collect the seed, and it grows more plants next year. And also, if we leave the seed heads in the winter, that feeds our bird populations. 25% of our birds feed on seed. And so keeping like coneflowers up in the wintertime and not cleaning up your garden so much and cutting everything down helps the birds. I mean, you know, you can supplemental feed with seed, but it also helps the birds to have that foraging capacity on what we would call the shoulder seasons.
True.
So fall into winter.
So I
important.
noticed on that zinnia there was, it looked like an ant. It could be a little bee, but are all insects pollinators?
So there are many kinds of pollinators, and not only